Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP, and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Marianna Bacallao, and this is Nashville. The majority of Nashville is Christian, 70% according to a recent study by the Barna Group. You probably didn't need a study to tell you that. It's everywhere in the city, not just in the historic churches with beautiful stonework or the newer congregations with built-in coffee shops and one-word names. It's the box of donuts with verses on the side from your favorite bakery, or whether your license plate starts with letters or numbers. When it's 2 a.m. and you're craving hush puppies from Cookout, you'll find gospel there too. John 3:16 imprinted on grease-soaked wax paper. But while the majority of Nashville is Christian, the Barna study also found that only 34% of people regularly attend church. That's in line with national trends. Church attendance took a big hit in 2016 and again in 2020. Now, there's a growing number of people who are leaving mainline denominations and the evangelical church in particular. Joining me to talk about the evangelical movement and why so many people are moving away from it is Holly Meyer, religion news editor at the Associated Press, also former religion reporter at the Tennessean, and Reverend Diane Delgert from the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashville. Holly, Diane, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Holly, I'll start with you. What exactly is evangelicalism?
It is a strain of Christianity. In the U.S., it looks like a very personal relationship with Jesus. Conversion or evangelizing is an important part of it. And then also, like, the largest denomination in the U.S. is the Southern Baptist Convention, and they are predominantly white evangelicals. And so they are also have a very conservative theology. Now, on that note, there is still diversity among evangelicals. So not everything applies to everyone, but that emphasis on the personal relationship with Jesus as well as evangelism are very important.
So it's not a denomination, but certain churches can be evangelical.
Yes, correct. It's a type of Christianity.
Where do you see evangelicalism's cultural impact the most?
I would say that two places. One is in American politics. It comes up a lot either in the policies that are being advocated for by politicians and various other stakeholders, as well as in the voting bloc. It can be a powerful force for why people make the decisions they do when they go to the polling places. And then perhaps a lesser known one, but frequent in the world of breaking news, I often would run into evangelicals in the wake of disaster. They are a well-oiled machine in many cases when it comes to responding to disaster relief. Either, they're coming out with chainsaws and helping clean up after storms, or they're helping feed local first responders.
What does its global impact look like?
It's not unique to the United States. There are certainly growing groups in places, especially like Latin America. I would say that's probably about all I can say, like, in terms of globally about the evangelical reach. But yeah, there's very much a representation here in the U.S.
Diane, I want to turn to you. For you, what differentiates evangelicals from other Christians?
Oh, gosh, that's a hard one to answer because Christianity itself, there's so much diversity within it. And I think in part that, especially what we see here in Nashville, and I'm not a native Nashvilleian, but what we see here is that a big impact of the evangelical movement here. And I think that the things that I would say have already been said about what it is. But if you dug deeper in the Nashville community, that there's Catholics who are Christian, there are mainline Protestants who are Christian and would just define their faith differently than the evangelicals.
Diane, how do you know you step foot in an evangelical church?
There's generally a style of worship, and I can't say that I have set foot in a lot of evangelical churches, but the ones that I have, there's a different style of worship that tends to be a little more spirit focused, if that's the right word, a little bit more spirited music, very focused on gospel preaching, preaching from the four gospels of the Bible, and the conversion experience and that personal relationship with Jesus.
There's a growing movement of people identifying as ex-evangelical or exvangelical after they leave the evangelical tradition. What do you think is behind that movement? Holly, let's hear from you first.
I think that good thing to note about the word exvangelical is it tells us where folks are coming from, but not necessarily where they're going. And exvangelicals could go to a different faith tradition, or they could end up doing away altogether with organized religion. And when they do that, they're joining a broader trend that's been going on in the U.S. for at least 3 decades. It's called the Nones, the Nones, which is a reference to survey questions that people are asked, what is your religion? And over the decades, that box of people who check none of the above has been growing. So they would fit into that group of people, depending upon if they chose to reject organized religion altogether. And among that group are the atheists, the agnostics, and the larger chunk of that are the people who would pick nothing in particular. And the diversity among them is broad, but what they share in common is they just really don't like organized religion.
Mm-hmm. Diane, what about you? What do you think is behind that movement?
I think there's multiple factors. I think one is just kind of general cultural shifts, where once it was, so important to fit into the larger culture, and this isn't just Nashville, it's other places that I've been, that you have to go to church. And here the predominant faith tradition is Christianity, so you have to belong to a Christian church, which is why a lot of people make their way through my doors, the Unitarian Universalist Church, because we have been welcoming of people of faith traditions other than Christianity for a long time. But aside from that, I think in part it's the larger cultural trends. I think that there's, because of the internet and access to some different approaches to theology and understandings of who God is and who Jesus is, and different understandings of different religions. And I think a lot of it's similar in ways, but I can't draw the exact comparison to the numbers of people who left Catholicism because of the revelations of the abuse that was going on in the Catholic Church. And we're hearing reports from evangelical churches, not so much of the sexual abuse that was going on in the Catholic Church, but of abuses of power. So I think it's a big mix. I don't think there's one reason that people leave.
All right. If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Marianna Bacallao. We're talking this hour about evangelicalism and why a growing number of people are leaving the tradition. Diane, your church offers a class for people re-examining their faith or the church traditions they grew up with. What do you hear from exvangelicals who attend?
It's not all that different from people who have left other faith traditions, because we have been seeing this for years and years. Often we're the only place in town, any given town, where people can come and ask questions and they can express their doubts. So kind of across the board is people either find that their belief system does no longer aligns or maybe never did. Sometimes people are leaving because of painful experiences. And some people are leaving just because they want to explore something bigger and broader than what they've been exposed to. So again, I don't think I can say that I hear one thing from people leaving the evangelical traditions.
Now, I want to zoom out for just a second because church attendance is down across the board, not just in evangelical churches. Holly, what have we seen from recent waves of people no longer going to services?
Right. So I would say that just because a person is not attending a traditional, what we would think of traditionally as a church service on Sundays, doesn't mean that they don't have some sort of spiritual part of their life in their search for truth, et cetera. We're seeing almost like sort of a DIYing of their own personal faith. And that can look like an array of things from meditation and yoga to belief in that crystals have energy, or just like not being, like still being religious and prayerful and believing in a higher power without being connected to an institution.
The Barna survey I mentioned earlier finds that most people without churches in Nashville said they would consider going if they found a church that felt welcoming and accepting. Diane, what can churches do to create that more welcoming and accepting environment?
Oh, that's always a challenge, and I'd like to say that we have perfected that, which is not true. But I think that a big piece of it is in approaching people with a very non-judgmental stance and openness to welcoming them as they are, with all of their identities, with all of their religious past or non-religious past, and to be curious and inviting. I don't know if that helps, but that's what we strive to do here.
All right. Thank you. Reverend Diane Daugert ministers at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashville, and Holly Meyer is the religion news editor for the Associated Press. Diane and Holly, thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much.
We have to take a short break. When we come back, we'll hear from an ex-pastor and a therapist about why they left evangelicalism and how they've helped others through the process of leaving. Stay with us. This is Nashville.
Funding for This is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Marianna Bacallao, and this is Nashville. Today, we're talking about exvangelicals, people who have left the evangelical church. The changing political landscape and the fallout of the pandemic have contributed to the decline, but the decision to leave a church community is often very personal and difficult. Before the break, we heard about what makes a church or a person evangelical. Now I'm joined by two people who have left evangelicalism and work to help others do the same. I'd like to welcome Dr. Laura Anderson, therapist and author of the book, Why Religion Hurts You, Healing from Religious Trauma and the Impact of High Control Religion. And Mike Mashiro, an ex-pastor who coaches queer Christians who are also leaving the evangelical church. Laura, Mike, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Yeah, likewise. Hi, Laura. Thanks for having me.
Mike, you were first introduced to Christianity at a young age by evangelical missionaries in Guam. You then moved to Oregon when you were 10 and attended a Baptist church. What was that cultural shift like?
Well, I guess firstly, just the obvious part was there were a lot less brown people when I moved. But beyond that, the theology was the same. So we somehow found the same religious community and doctrinal beliefs halfway across the world, which I think is telling. So within the theology side of the church experience, it was the same. The people in the room just looked different.
How did existing in that predominantly white space shape your church experience?
Well, like when people are deriving meaning from any kind of spiritual text, it's going to obviously apply to the context they find themselves in. And on Guam, there was a lot more of an emphasis on a communal experience, right? It's a warm climate culture. And so the community side of things was a lot more pronounced. When I came to the States, there was a way more an individual approach to how these biblical principles were being applied and practiced. And so that was a big shift. There was a lot more independence and individuality when I came to the mainland. I would not have been able to point that out at the time, but when I look back, I can, it's pretty obvious. And so there was a lot more like personal responsibility, individual, contribution to what one's theology was. Whereas in Guam, there was a lot more of a collective, like uniformity, I think, to how the practices were played out. And then, just even in conversation, the way we talked about things was different. There's a lot more assumptions and like unspokens in Guam, whereas in America, there was a lot more, in the mainland, there was a lot more specific, like explicit dialogue around what are we saying, who's going to hell, who's in, who's out, that kind of stuff. I would say those are probably the biggest differences that I could recall as a kid.
You went on to become a pastor. What made you want to leave evangelicalism?
Well, the first biggest motivator was I had been a gay guy in the closet my whole life. And so being in evangelicalism, that was something that I had to harbor if I was going to continue to experience any form of acceptance and approval, right? So when I was in my early 30s, that's when my spiritual journey started kind of cresting, I suppose, and I could no longer subject myself to the beliefs and the practices of evangelicalism, knowing what I'd known up to that point in my body and with my own personal journey with who I know God to be. So ultimately, the catalyst for me choosing to deconstruct my faith and then eventually leave evangelicalism was it started with how the LGBTQ plus community is treated in those spaces.
Laura, you grew up in the evangelical church. Your dad ran an evangelical camp for kids, and you worked in Christian spaces until you were 25. What made you split with the church after so many years?
There was a variety of reasons, part of which was my own story and experiencing a lot of spiritual abuse. I didn't have language for it at the time, but my own embodied experience, I knew something wasn't right. Also going back to school for my own schooling in marriage and family therapy and beginning to work with people, it was very difficult to just be working with people and seeing real life experiences. Everything I had been told growing up, it wasn't making sense as I was seeing people in my office. And I had to start to rethink. And specifically with people in the LGBTQ community, I couldn't reckon like all these things that I had been taught. And then I'm having people in my office and I'm watching them struggle through things, and I just couldn't piece things together. That was very big for me. Ultimately, what led me out of it was my own experience in a domestically violent relationship. And when I was getting out of that, one night after I had kicked him out of our home, I was looking at my journals and I couldn't tell who said what. Was it my abusive partner or was it the pastors, the people in leadership at the church? And I thought, well, this is really weird and really bad. Was it him? Was it God? And that led me towards a path of disentangling my faith. I had been asking questions for years, but that was a really pivotal point in my own life where I really had to look at what I was being taught. And ultimately, that was the deconstruction part of it, which is more of a philosophical or cognitive process. But there was a lot of trauma that went along with it, where I really had to look more at the embodied pieces of it and do a lot of trauma work, which also plays into my professional side as well.
You mentioned spiritual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk more about what that is?
Yeah, I mean, spiritual is just a word that helps contextualize where the abuse happened. It happened in a spiritual and or religious context from a spiritual authority. And so it was abuse that happened from pastors in a religious context. It was them using the positions that they had in my life as the spiritual authority, as pastors, to get me to do things, to take advantage of my time, energy, resources, to wield their power over me, to control the people that I was in relationships with, how I spent my time and money, how I dressed, how I spoke, even down to the things that I ate, what I did with free time. Every bit of my life was controlled. And I believe that to be spiritual abuse.
What does it mean to deconstruct? And I'd like to hear from both of you, but Mike first.
Yeah. So growing up in evangelicalism, you have such specific, I want to say guardrails for life, but it's not kind of like what Laura's saying. It is a very controlling space. So there's a very specific prescribed way that you're allowed to exist in the world. Ranging from your sexual orientation or gender identity over to like the role in your household or what kind of position you can hold in the church specifically, but then it also bleeds out into society at large. And so there's so much like deeply ingrained ideas around what being human means, who God is, like the nature of humanity, how you're meant to relate to other people. It's pervasive. It goes in every crevice of your life. So, and then when you're experiencing this level of like conditioning from a young age before you're even cognitively able to critically think through these ideas, there's an indoctrination that happens. You become like very programmed to think and live in the world in a certain way. And so when that's been going on for decades of your life, and then your lived experience starts to contradict at a fundamental level these beliefs you're holding. So like for someone like me, my sexual identity is in contradiction to these ideas I've been living under my whole life. And eventually my humanity won out in my spirituality over the doctrine. So deconstruction was me having to look at the fundamental ideas and building blocks of the religion I was part of and ask, is this true? Basically, right? Just getting to the very basics of it as much as one is able to. And so for me, some big ones were, is it true that gay people are going to hell, aren't loved by God, are deserving of death, should be rejected, are sinful in nature, right? Like that was a big one that I had to challenge, like wrestle through. But then, other ideas came up, like, is hell real? Does hell even exist? And then if it does, who goes there and why? Those are very clear in evangelicalism. And, the older you become, I suppose, if you become more conscious of other people in the world, those ideas become a lot less tenable. And it's like, how is this so authoritative and unquestioned? And so questions like salvation and sin and the nature of God and who is Jesus, these questions start coming up in the deconstruction process. And people can go as far and as deep as they'd like in pulling these ideas apart and ultimately walking away from them if that's where it leads them. I would say, in my experience, deconstruction is a range. There's a range, like there's a spectrum to it, right? So some people deconstruct lightly, some people go hard at it, some people fully like abandon everything they had ever been taught because as a result of their deconstruction. So for me, it started with my sexuality needs to find context and I need to figure out how to like reconcile that with myself and my beliefs. But then as I continued to learn how other people had been marginalized and hurt by these beliefs, I had to keep listening, and the ideas kept having to be questioned. Like none of them were islands; they all were interwoven and connected. And so as I kept pulling these things apart, these ideas and beliefs I'd been taught my whole life continued to fail to be substantiated when it came to all the other evidence we have in the world, whether it's science or biology or the medical profession. Like we've got cosmology, we've got all this stuff that contradicts what's in the Bible and how the Bible had been wielded by straight white Christian men most of my life. And so, yeah, I was getting to the root of those ideas and finding that they actually weren't sourced in anything substantive. For me, that's like a big flavor of what my deconstruction looked like.
Laura, what about you? What did your deconstruction look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mike did a great job of explaining deconstruction, what it is. I think it's important to note that deconstruction is a philosophical concept. It's something that we can and should be doing for the rest of our lives. And it's this process of untangling. I love to say that it's the opposite of how so many of us grew up in fundamentalism, where there was this process of certainty. There's this very rigid black and white way of thinking where you have good and bad, right or wrong. And so deconstruction is where we're kind of pulling at these threads, and we're always being curious and asking questions. And so it's almost this posture of living where we can hold things with an open hand and always be open to changing and asking, okay, is there more? Do I need to look deeper? And so my process mirrors what Mike is saying a lot in terms of really taking a deep look at what was I taught, and is that right? Because as I'm kind of flipping over stones, I'm noticing, oh, well, then there's this question to ask, and this question to ask, and this question to ask. And evangelicalism, there's a real focus on certainty, of being certain of what you believe in. And I think deconstructing is about not necessarily being certain. I know sometimes people put an emphasis on, well, okay, then you have to reconstruct and you have to come to this new place of certainty. I would invite people to consider that you don't actually have to come to that space. You can actually deconstruct the rest of your life. And that's not to say you have to be deep in the weeds of it all the time. It's just always having that open hand to say, I might be wrong. And I can always be open to asking more questions and being curious and learning new things. And when we do that, we can be open to new experiences and new people and learning from other people in life. And I think that then allows us to stay away from becoming fundamentalist again.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Marianna Bacallao. We're talking this hour about why people are separating themselves from evangelical churches and what's next for them after they leave. Mike, you left the evangelical tradition, but you didn't leave the Christian faith. Why do you still identify as Christian?
That's a good question. I want to acknowledge that this is going to be like very subjective to me, but there are three main reasons why I'm still holding on to the title or identity of Christian. And I've had to think this through because so much of what I believe and don't believe anymore, an evangelical would say that I am not a Christian. But my first reason of maintaining the title is because, one, there is not a governing body in the world that gets to dictate who's a Christian and who's not. Christianity as a tradition, as a faith tradition, has continued to evolve and progress and pivot and change its mind about issues over the last couple thousand years, right? Like that's been a big part of the beauty of what Christianity has been able to be in the world. There has been so much harm and toxicity that's come from Christianity practiced in bad, horrifying ways. But I also find a lot of beauty and like significance within the Christian tradition at this point still in my process. And I love what Laura said. I think that I would like to continue to be evolving as a person, and the ideas that I'm entertaining and holding as valuable continuously for the rest of my life. So I hope that people, can continue to exercise that kind of participation in the things that they hold most valuable and true. But for me, one, other people don't get to tell you you're not a Christian. It's a very evangelical thing to do, but they're not entitled to it. So there's that. The second one is like, I hate the idea of leaving Christianity, what I understand and value about it now, to the worst of its iteration. Seeing the rise of Christian nationalism and right-wing conservative evangelicals kind of being the trope and representation of Christianity to America specifically today is a nightmare. Like, there's so much about evangelicalism that I find to be deplorable and inhuman, and still practiced and defended. And so for me, I don't want to just leave this faith tradition that I was raised in and have found a lot of beauty in to these kinds of zealots in the world, because that's a version. I like how someone said in the earlier part of the show, it's like a strain of Christianity. This doesn't belong to them. They're not the definition or the pinnacle or the example of Christianity. They are an iteration. And I would love to see that kind of wane as we continue to expand and evolve around these ideas. And then lastly, I find the Christocentric approach to the Bible to be really powerful and beautiful. I think that the message of Jesus has a lot of meaningful, important values that still are relevant today that I don't want to just throw away. It's more work to sift through the good and the bad, but I still think there's a lot of value there. And so holding the title of Christian also just with my public work allows me to reach out to the people that are coming from where I came from, who are probably looking for the answers that I'm trying to help make more accessible through my platforms. I would like to speak to the people who, to the me 5 and 10 years ago, who needed some of these answers that I couldn't find otherwise, because it's so scary to look outside of the echo chamber you were raised in, because everything outside of it is demonized and, going to lead you astray or deceive you, or the devil's going to come after you or whatever. So I would like to be accessible to people who still feel culturally attached to and identify with the Christian space. And so those are all the main reasons. I don't feel super precious on the term. I think it more just feels like on a philosophical and cultural level, it's more relevant right now for me to hold it than not. I'm not interested in converting anybody to any form of belief. I would just love to see the level of toxicity and harm reduce and the experience of liberation for people, especially within their spirituality, to increase.
Laura, what do you hear from other people who you've helped through the deconstruction process?
Oh, I hear a lot of things. The work that I do focuses on healing from religious trauma, which includes deconstruction, but isn't limited to just that. For me, I like to differentiate between deconstruction as a philosophical process, like what we've been talking about, and healing from religious trauma as a physiological process. I also like to say religious trauma is trauma. The word religion just helps us further contextualize where the trauma occurred. And so the people that I work with like to, I don't know, this might sound weird, but what they like to tell me is that they feel very validated in the work that we're doing together, to know that they don't have to convince me that it was that bad. They oftentimes feel that they are met by people who don't believe them, who think that maybe they were just hurt, a little bit, minimally. Maybe a pastor didn't like something that they had to say, or that, they sinned, quote unquote, and somebody, kind of got on them for that, and they didn't like that. And so now they have trauma from that. When in reality, the things that they've experienced are genuinely harmful. And so when they come to work with myself and my colleagues, to know that they are validated and believed is absolutely, it changes everything. And I love that part of the work that I do.
Dr. Laura Anderson is a therapist who specializes on healing from religious trauma. Mike Mashiro is an ex-pastor who coaches other Christians leaving the evangelical church. Mike, Laura, I want to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
We have to take a short break. When we come back, we'll hear from 2 activists with evangelical roots about why they left and what they're up to now. What does being an evangelical or an ex-evangelical mean to you? Tweet us at This Is Nashville. We'll be right back. I'm Marianna Bacallao, and this is Nashville. The United Methodist Church made history yesterday when its conference voted to repeal a long-standing rule which banned LGBTQ people from serving as clergy. But it wasn't easy getting here. The UMC lost a quarter of its total churches between 2019 and 2023, mainly over the denomination's view on LGBTQ rights. While the UMC has adopted more progressive values, other churches have swung right. That's alienated a growing group of people identifying as exvangelical, people who have left the evangelical church. We've been talking this hour about what evangelicalism is and why people have formed a strong identity over leaving it. Joining me to talk more about the exvangelical movement is Heather May, a singer-songwriter and activist, and Eve. She goes by Eve Was Framed Online. We're using her online handle to protect her safety. She's the co-host of Chewed Gum, which examines purity culture in evangelical spaces. Heather, Eve, thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having me.
Heather, you grew up going to a UMC church. What does this recent vote mean to you?
Oh, I left the church 21 years ago. It's been 15 years, and I found out the news when I was in a cafe, and I sobbed, even with all that time. It hits really hard. My mind first goes to relief for the queer kids like me who grew up in the church or who are there now, knowing that they won't have to hide who they are. It's a relief for the families too, knowing that they can walk into a church together, holding hands, feeling, without judgment. But, alongside that relief is an anger. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who is a minister and still in the church. And, one of the things that she texted me was more funerals than baptisms. And, I wouldn't be honoring my full self if I didn't at least acknowledge that. While I am incredibly relieved and, I'm holding back tears, just even talking about this, that there is an anger, anger for all the lives lost, the families torn apart. While this move is going to, heal deep, deep wounds for those of us who are still in or raised in the United Methodist Church, it's also a reminder of what was lost and the pain.
The UMC church of your childhood wasn't an evangelical church. How did you get involved with evangelicalism?
There was, it was really big then. And so I've taken a step away for sure. It's been a minute since I've walked into a United Methodist church. But when I was in high school, even when I was in middle school, it was really, really popular. These like evangelical, I would say, we just called them Christian. We didn't even call them evangelical. We just called them like Christian retreats or conferences or, mission trips, et cetera. And that's really what it was. It was like they would drop off flyers, these like groups, and they would at youth groups and be like, hey, we're hosting a Christian, conference this, weekend. And like, if any youth want to come. And at first, I remember when I was younger, I don't remember it being like fire and brimstone at my church. But when I saw this like clever marketing towards like, find community, you're not a weirdo, we see you, do you want to like love God in a really cool way? I was like, yeah, that sounds great. Finding more community of people who are like me sounds good. And that's really where without knowing it, I stepped into this evangelical movement. And my the work I'm doing now is really focused on empowering those who, really were very centered in the purity movement, because that's where many of us, that's really where, and I know that I'm going to get flack for this because that's what happens, but that's really where the brainwashing happened for many of us.
Eve, you were a bit of a Bible scholar when you were part of the evangelical church. Why is it that so often people who are very devout and take their religion very seriously in their youth ultimately end up leaving the church?
Yeah, I definitely was trying to be a biblical scholar, which is a big part of my story. I wanted to know the Bible inside and out. I wanted to know God inside and out. And I think it was that devoutness and that persistence to really get to the bottom of all of this that inevitably had me wanting to be very honest throughout my journey, which led me to having to be honest when I lost all belief. I realized I didn't have a good reason to continue believing in not only this God anymore, but any God.
What does it mean to deconstruct from the church as women?
That's a whole other ballgame than just deconstructing in general, because the hierarchy that is formed under evangelicalism, which is God first, then men or your husband, and then the wife, and then the children. And so you have come out of a system of oppression, and whether you personally were experiencing the light version of oppression or actual abuse, that is something that you have to oftentimes get professional help. That's why I'm such a fan of what Dr. Laura does. There is so much trauma attached. And even if you didn't experience actual abuse, most likely you were living under these doctrines telling you that your value is attached to your husband or your partner or to God, and that you basically are third in line.
What were some of the hardest things to work through when deconstructing? And I'd like to hear from both of you, but Heather first, if you could.
Oh my gosh. Well, knowing that I belong to myself, that I'm not property of anyone, was a really big one. You know, I am queer, and my partner and I, we are both activists and songwriters, and you know, and we write about social justice issues. We're both deeply heavy in the feminist movement, and you know, she doesn't want me asking her approval for things. And yet, even though, as I said, it's been 15 years, I still to this day find myself like that natural leaning towards like needing approval from anyone, whoever's in the room. And that fight inside of myself, that did not come from me. Realizing that I'm not a temptation, not a stumbling block, was a really big one in my early 20s, and I'm not responsible for others' actions. As a survivor, that was a really hard thing. I was attacked when I was 18 years old, and I didn't realize. I didn't call it by its name, which was that I was raped. I didn't call it that until I was 33 years old. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that I have, you know, that indoctrination. Evangelical churches, you know, you asked earlier, you asked Holly and Diane, what are evangelical churches? Well, they're very loving. They're very community focused, but that's why it's so dangerous. The manipulation is so quiet. It's saturated in language that's like, we love you and God loves you, which opens your mind up to possibilities. So when the language changes to, so don't be this and don't do this. And if you do this, then it's your fault. We naturally go, oh, well, if I want to be loved, I can't be myself or be human. And I'm awful for disappointing my, you know, God, dad, and all of that just breeds so much shame. So for me, you know, it was just that realizing that I belong deeply to myself. I am not property of anyone.
What about you, Eve?
For me, the main two things that I struggled to deconstruct from, and to this day I still have to keep tabs on that part of myself, is the part I was taught not to trust myself. You know, the Bible says to lean not on your own understanding. And I was also taught that the world is binary. Things are this or that. This is a sin or it's not. This is of God or it's of the devil. And learning to navigate in a world that's gray and there's nuance and there's a spectrum of things has been the greatest joy of leaving, and also one of the more difficult things to navigate. Once you're told not to trust yourself, you're told that you're desperately wicked when you're born, and that was the biggest part. And so I think that goes back to what Heather was saying too, that you belong deeply to yourself, which I love. I love that. And learning how to take those steps forward and trust yourself has been the biggest key for me deconstructing from all of this. It's how I've been able to figure out, do I believe this? Do I not believe it? Because I could rely on my own understanding.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Marianna Bacallao. We're talking this hour about the growing movement of exvangelicals and how they're finding community outside of church. Eve, your dad was a pastor when you were growing up and is still involved in the evangelical church. How did you go about carving out that space outside of your home to start questioning?
Yeah. So I got married very young, so I was already out of the house, but I was going to ministry school, and that's when I had kind of my moment where I realized I didn't believe anymore. And I kind of stepped away from everything for a couple of years. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to be a part of that space. I didn't want to have to explain what I believed and why, like I had done for years and years of my life. But January 6th happened, and I was hearing some really sad things from people I had grown up admiring and learning my own moral compass from. And I felt like a new perspective needed to be shared. And I didn't feel comfortable doing it in the spaces where my family's ministry was happening. That was creating a lot of familial problems. And so TikTok had become really popular during COVID. And I was one of those who was like, I will never get on TikTok. I don't want to do this. But it felt like a safe space where I could stay anonymous, which is funny to say now, hundreds and thousands of people later. But I was able to start just sharing my story a little bit. And I was shocked at how many it resonated with.
How hard was it to break from a church that had such significance to your family?
It was and is the hardest thing I've ever done. That was my entire life. That was my community. That was my identity. And leaving that is already hard enough. Doing that and knowing the pain that it's causing people I deeply love and still enjoy to this day was life-altering in all the worst and best ways.
The church is a big source of community for many people, particularly here in Nashville. Sometimes it's people you know from church who watch your kids or bring you meals when you've experienced a loss. How can people who have left find that community on the other side? I'll go to Heather first.
You know, I was kind of hoping you would go to Eve on this one because I myself am still, I'm still struggling with this, which is why I was really glad to be on this segment because I feel like I'm not alone in that. I had such a big community. I was bullied really badly when I was younger for being a redhead, for being freckled, for being a little fat kid. I was really bullied pretty bad. And when I went to the church, the bullying stopped and it felt so safe. And what I didn't realize is that the bullying didn't stop, it just changed. And I still find myself grieving that community. And the only place that I found that same kind of love and acceptance, but this time it is genuine, is really the queer community that I have found through my music as a songwriter who writes openly about being queer, and also the queer community here in Nashville. It's a very common thread, narrative, a story. You could talk about it with any queer person, and either they themselves have experienced it or, their partner has experienced religious trauma. But that's really where I found so much love and acceptance is in that. And it's really particularly special given, how it is not easy to be LGBTQ here in the South. But we're still here and we're not going anywhere.
Eve, in the less than minute we have left, how have you found community?
Yeah, for me, that's why I started the platform, was looking for community. And I did find that. I found so many amazing individuals Another incredible organization is Recovering from Religion, and they're a nonprofit that has support groups all over the world, actually. And they also have the Clergy Project, which helps members of clergy who are questioning their faith find financial support and peer support. So there are some incredible people out there that are looking to help others find that community. And I think my main piece of advice is you have to actively look for that, because that is the number one loss when leaving a religion you've been a part of your whole life, is the loss of community.
That is all the time we have today. Eve, Heather, thank you so much for being with us. Eve is an evangelical activist. Heather May is a singer-songwriter, and she's going to play us out with her latest, as yet unreleased single, Kissing Girls. Thanks for tuning in this hour. This is Nashville is a production of Nashville Public Radio. Today's episode was produced by Magnolia McKay. It was directed by Tasha A.F. Lemley. Our technical director is Liv Lombardi. The masterminds behind our theme song are Larange and Amir Blade. Special thanks to Stephen Mason, Adam Bazard, Melody Walker, Benji Fay, Bob Simitana, Leaf, Laura Chiefitz, Emily Hardesty, and Nina Cardona. Listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get good podcasts. The conversation doesn't end here. Tweet us at thisisnashville, find us on Instagram, and tell us what you want from our show by filling out our quick survey online. This is Nashville. I'm Marianna Bacallao. We'll see you Monday, everybody. And as a wise man once said, be good to each other.
Kissing girls as long as I've been kissing boys. And I don't know why. I kiss and tell about everyone.